Your Honor, understand very clearly, Bella fought back for her life. The frenulum, the connective tissue between her upper lip and her gum, had a centimeter and a half laceration. She bit her tongue multiple times before she died. She fought back for her life as her father smothered her. Celeste had no such injuries. In fact, she had no external injuries at all. But according to the medical examiner, she was smothered nonetheless.
Hello and welcome to the Patreon channel of True Crime Rocket Science. In today's episode we'll be looking at the idea of Chris Watts showing emotion. We'll be exploring the importance of emotion in true crime and in the Watts case, and we'll also be asking the question, basically two questions. Number one, does Chris Watts show emotion? That's number one. And number two, assuming that he does, what is Chris Watts' most emotional moment? Now, in yesterday's episode, we dealt with an expert who briefly mentioned certain aspects of Chris Watts' psychology. She didn't really talk much about his emotions except to repeat what most people have said, that there's an absence of emotional behavior. That's literally what she says. That he talks about himself and that there's an absence of emotional behavior. And this, as I say, sort of flows into the whole notion that Chris Watts is a narcissist. In today's episode, we're going to take that conversation a little bit further, but we're also going to take it into a totally different area. Before we get there, I want to thank the 40 or so patrons on Patreon. It's welcome to all of you. Thank you also for your comments on the channel. Thank you for your contributions. And I hope you're going to find today's episode challenging, compelling, and perhaps taking your thoughts and minds in terms of this particular case in a direction that perhaps it hasn't often gone into. That is the job of True Crime Rocket Science, to challenge you, to get you to think, and to take you into areas that perhaps you haven't been before, with other commentators, pundits, reporters, experts. And so let's get started. So what I want to do, and I'm going to do it using an example, so we will refer to that example quite a few times, but the question I've got for you is, does Chris have no emotion? And I want you to leave a comment immediately now and just answer that question. Before we go into the show, well, not the show, but the episode, before we go into it in more detail, just let's hear your side of the story. And I would really appreciate if as many of you as possible can comment either on the video or on the Patreon page, just saying what you think. I'm going to give you guys a few moments to do that. Just yes or no, does Chris Watts show emotion? Does he have any emotion? What do you think? And when we sit on this thought, where we don't just say it and, we're convinced, we know it for a fact, we sit on this thought and we sort of, bring it into our lounge and we address it, we find that it's a lot more interesting and kind of a lot more subtle than we first thought. True crime is weird because it is in a way you can handpick or cherry pick whatever reality you want. So there's the reality that is reality, objective reality, and then there's the more subjective reality where you look into something and you might not be seeing the person for who they are. You might be seeing the person for who you kind of want them to be. You might want them to have no emotion. You might want them to be a monster, because that then means you are good and they are evil. It means there's nothing connecting you to the disaster of their lives. It means you are safe and right and they are bad and wrong, right? But as I say, as soon as we bring this monster into the room, and emotion is a monster, we find ourselves with a different animal, right? There's a reason why many people are reluctant to even go down this road, and why it's somewhat difficult for even a true crime writer to do that. Because as soon as you do, people say, well, if you're seeing emotion in a criminal, in a murderer, in any person who's committed an antisocial crime like this, then you must be sympathizing with him. You're looking at him and you're saying, wow, I think he feels bad about what he did in some way. I think he's not happy. Then outsiders will say, the fact that you are not chastising him, judging him, angry with him, means that you must be on his side. And I've been increasingly been accused of that. And before we even address the emotional thing in a specific way with Chris Watts, I want to address it in kind of a general way and just bring up something that has come up in my mind and in my experience through sitting through a number of criminal trials. You sit through enough criminal trials and you hear the judge say, you've not shown any remorse, and as a result they then get the maximum sentence. I sat through the whole Henry van Breda triple axe murder trial, and he showed very little emotion. I wouldn't say he never cried on the stand. I mean, his whole family axed to death, including his older brother and his younger sister who survived. But the only time that he actually became emotional, and he did become emotional, was when he could see that the judge, and he was a young guy on trial, he was like 20 years old, 21, was when he could sort of see that the judge wasn't buying his story. When it was like he'd been talking, and the judge would ask something, and then you could see the dismay and disappointment that, wow, I've put in so much effort and I don't think the judge believes me. And so it wasn't as though there wasn't emotion, it was just, again, emotion for himself. And often that's also where the conversation ends, is people will say, okay, there's not no emotion, there is emotion, but it's only for himself. But that's also not the full story. But the question is, if criminals are so often in trouble for not showing emotion, why don't they just act emotional? If their lives are on the line, if they are in court and they are going to be sentenced, and if they show remorse, their sentence might be halved, or it might be 3/4 or whatever it is. But surely there's an incentive in showing emotion, so why don't they act emotional? And the flip side to the story is, in Henry van Breda's case, for example, what he's thinking while he's on trial is of having an appeal. He's thinking of, this court case is over, I haven't succeeded, I've failed, and so he's already investing himself emotionally and otherwise in the next trial. And you kind of have that with a lot of accused. It was also the same with Jason Roeder. I think Oscar Pistorius was elated when he got a less than 5-year sentence, and he's not showing emotion either. He's not showing, well, I'm smiling, I'm glad because I wasn't sentenced to 10 years, right? And what I think a lot of people don't realize is you've got to see it in context, where an accused is in court, and again, this doesn't quite apply to Chris Watts, but when an accused is in court, I know in America you refer to them as the defendant, but you know who I'm talking about. When the perpetrator is in court and they've denied that they've committed the crime, then they can't show emotion, because either way they're going to be judged on that. So, for example, showing remorse is another way of communicating, yes, I did commit this crime, and I'm sorry that I did it. And you must see it within that narrative of they are not showing remorse because they are trying to show that they're innocent. That's what their focus is. Of course, it's a separate argument to say, well, whether or not they're playing these games, isn't it surely their feelings of love and attachment to their own family should overcome them whether or not they committed this crime? In other words, their family is gone. Shouldn't they be emotional about that? And the answer is yes, they should. But again, this is discounting criminal psychology, which is if you've premeditated a crime, then you've resolved to do it. In other words, you've sat with your own emotions and you've kind of gone, whatever. I don't mean to be flippant about it, but the bottom line is, with a premeditated crime, such as in the case of Nicole Brown Simpson's gruesome murder, and also that of Lacey Peterson, where Scott Peterson murdered his pregnant wife. Any premeditated murder, the emotions of the murderer are out of the window, exactly for the reason that they feel they want to commit the crime. They're not committing the crime because they don't want to. They're not committing the crime because they don't have any emotion. They're committing the crime because they do have emotion. And I think people forget when a murder happens, it's because someone really doesn't like somebody else. In many cases, I don't think in the Watts case that he really didn't like his children. I think he had mixed feelings towards his children, but I think his feelings towards Shanann was that sense of incredible dislike, and just really not liking a person. And why would you then miss them, and why would you feel sorry about what you did if you did what you did because of how you felt? So instead of emotion being something that is hypothetical to true crime, in fact, emotion is a real key to understanding true crime. It's really through the emotional reality of the victim, and also the emotional reality of the perpetrator, that you are really going to figure out the reality of the case and why it happened. And their emotional realities are completely different from ours. In the same way that how you feel about finances in your life and how you feel about certain people in your life, whether it's family members, friends, relationships, even how you feel about yourself, those feelings matter very, very little to other people. But in the context of true crime, the importance is paramount. These emotions drive the criminals. They drive the crime. And so all I really want you to do is acknowledge, first of all, that there are emotions. And now we're going to spend a little bit of time dealing with Chris Watts' emotions. And we're going to start by just thinking about Bella. Thinking about Bella separately from everybody else. Separately from Nicole Kessinger. Separately from Shanann. Separately from Cece. And also separately from the pregnancy. When we just take Bella and we take her out of that whole equation, and although it's in a way unfair and it's not completely accurate, because one does need to see her as part of a dynamic, just think about Bella's relationship with her father. Bella was a lot like her father. Bella was also quite reserved. When Watts described his children to the media, and that's also an emotional moment when he sort of stutters. I've covered that on the TCRS YouTube channel. But Watts sort of felt like she takes after him, that she is like him, right? And you also have that touching moment where Bella sings, my father is my hero. So at that time, Bella clearly loved her father. There was clearly a strong relationship between the father and his children up to a point, right? And where does that come from? Did that strong relationship come from what's having no emotions, or did it come from having some emotions? When he's playing with his children, is it because he cares about them or because he doesn't care about them? You can't suddenly say because he murdered them that he never cared about them. You can say when he murdered them, his feelings of caring about them were conflicted, were different. And I think there's a big discrepancy between the narrative most people believe and the narrative that actually happened. And it's in this area where Watts talks about the emotional conversation. He talks about there was an emotional remember he mentioned the emotional conversation on the Sermon on the Porch. This is before he acknowledged what had happened. But then he sort of said to Coda afterwards that he actually said it was actually quite emotional. He sort of told the media that it wasn't very emotional, and he was going to leave it at that. But to Coda he said it was very emotional. And then when he eventually admitted to the crime, it got so emotional that it led to the murder. So in other words, it went from, well, I wouldn't say it was an emotional conversation, and let's leave it at that, to a very emotional conversation, and then eventually one leading to the crime. My belief is that there was no emotional conversation. Not because Watts wasn't emotional, but because he was so emotional. And not only that, because he knew how emotional Shanann was. And because he was an introvert, he wanted to avoid this emotional conflagration. I mean, there was going to be, he knew he was going to kill Shanann, but he wanted to make it as painless as possible for himself, emotionally. He wanted it to be not emotional for himself. And I feel the same thing applied to the children. As bad as what he was doing, he didn't want them to suffer emotionally. And I know that doesn't sound like it makes sense. I mean, surely if you're murdering someone, it's the most emotional moment you're going to have in your life if you're the victim. But in terms of the perpetrator, he's thinking about them as well. I think he did care to some extent about his children, even though he was killing them. I mean, I know also that doesn't seem to make sense, but I don't think that he wanted to have them experience pain. And so that's part of the emotional reality as well. He didn't want his children to know what is happening to them. He didn't want them to see what is happening to them. He didn't want them to see him, and he didn't want to see himself through their eyes. So it's that emotional aspect as well. And so that's why I find people who now are suggesting that the children were alive, or one of the children were alive when they put through the tanks, is just craziness. It not only doesn't make sense in terms of criminal psychology, but it rubbishes the whole emotional argument as well. I mean, you could only make this argument if you believe Chris Watts has no emotion. But I also wonder about the emotional intelligence of people who make this claim, because it doesn't make any sense. And so for someone to be making this claim, I know what it's based on. It's based on a lot of the other YouTubers, and it's also based on a little bit of oil in the children's stomach. But it's completely separating that aspect from everything else, which as I said, doesn't make sense. And so before we go into this clip of Chris Watts, I want you to just acknowledge in your mind and in your heart that maybe this man, this murderer, did have once upon a time did have feelings of love for his eldest daughter. It was his first child, and she was like him, and maybe he did love her at one point, in the same way that he loved Shanann at one point, and those feelings had become clouded and mixed up and confused and even just fuzzy because of other emotions, because of his emotions towards Nicole Kessinger. She was like an emotional hurricane which just blew everybody else away. Doesn't that make sense? Okay, and so now that we're at about 20 minutes into this episode, I want to hand over the reins to you guys. And bearing in mind whatever your answer was when I asked you early on just to leave a comment, I want you to think about the question, does Watts have any emotion? Does Watts show any emotion? And those are two different questions. Having emotions and showing emotions are totally different. But whatever your answer to that, I want you to watch Chris Watts in this 50-second clip and just observe. Just see what you see and not what everyone else has been seeing or not seeing.
Your Honor, I understand very clearly. Bella fought back for her life. The frenulum, the connective tissue between her upper lip and her gum, had a centimeter and a half laceration. She bit her tongue multiple times before she died. She fought back for her life as her father smothered her. Celeste had no such injuries. In fact, she had no external injuries at all. But according to the medical examiner, she was smothered nonetheless.
So I don't know what you see when you see that.
Methodically and calmly.
What we tend to see is you hear the prosecutor's voice, and in a way that is informing what you are seeing, thinking, and feeling. You're appalled, you're responding. Often when you watching this, there are a lot of comments on some other video, and there's a lot of emotion there, a lot of exclamation marks, monster, whatever. And for this reason, the subtlety escapes you. So I think the first thing to address is Chris Watts and how did he say he felt about this particular moment. And we can go to the second confession on February 18th and get his exact words about this. Now, what he says about this doesn't mean it's true, but it gives us a little bit of a glimpse into his inner world, into his inner darkness, whether it's true or not. Whatever he says is telling us something about what he thinks about it, whether what he thinks is appropriate, whether it's true or not. It's just giving us some kind of hint about what is going on in his inner world, in his interiority, right? And as soon as we talk about emotions, we're acknowledging the inner world of this person, this monster, this criminal. And that's important to do, because most of the time we don't. We simply see a shell, we see their actions, and we almost congratulate ourselves on the fact that we don't understand them, that we can't understand them, that we never will understand them, that this is a psychopath and we'll never understand why he did what he did. And even the prosecutor kind of did this. In his sentencing, he sort of said, I don't think we'll ever know. That's not something to be proud of. I mean, and I don't think that is true either. I think if you want to know, knock on the door and it will be opened and you will know. And so if we go to the discovery from February 18th, Chris Watts says two things. The one is sort of in relation to kind of the committing of the crime, but the other is specifically what the prosecutor said. So first of all, he says he felt like someone else had control over him that day and he wasn't able to fight back, right? The second part is, he says, when the prosecutor said Bella bit her tongue repeatedly, he wanted to bang his own head up against a wall. Now, this is how I analyze both those statements, and bear in mind they're juxtaposed with one another. So if you go to the discovery, you're going to find those statements right next to each other. And it was as if Chris Watts brought up what the prosecutor said voluntarily. It was obviously something that stuck in his mind. He's sitting there at the sentencing and he's being triggered by statements. He's not saying anything, but he's being triggered by words, some of which are true, some of which aren't, and all of them are making him feel and respond in a different way, ways that we can't imagine. Well, I don't want to say can't imagine, we can imagine it, but ways that we can't see, right? Now, think about this idea of someone else having control over him. Well, couldn't that someone else have been him? Another part of himself, a more emotional part of himself. And we've all felt like that feeling where you can't fight back. Why can't you fight back? Because your emotions have taken over. You are doing something almost like a passenger, and you don't really want to be doing that. And I don't believe this crime happened because of that. I don't believe that he just snapped, which is an emotional story that a lot of criminals use, is that because they want to divorce themselves from the crime. So it's not a case that, even in the second confession, that is what he was trying to say, is that he just snapped. Now suddenly is it very emotional. But I don't believe it's like that. I mean, I think he was carried away by the emotions of being in love with another woman, in that sense. Not that he was drunk on emotions or just had no idea what he was doing. The idea that his brain was addled and his feelings were addled and his heart was compromised, and so his feelings towards his family were also compromised. Not this black and white thing that there were a huge amount of emotions, then no emotions. More a thing of emotions were there, and emotions do get do sort of control us to some extent. And I am going to put a post on the YouTube channel dealing with humiliation in Watts's life, because it's something that I've certainly found while studying true crime, just how important humiliation as a specific idea is to the driving forces of criminals. And you'll really be astonished what a powerful driver it is. And this brings us to the second point here, where Watts himself brings up this, he invokes this idea of the prosecutor saying, Bella bit her tongue repeatedly, and when he hears that, he wants to bang his head up against the wall. Now, I don't think Watts was aware that Bella was doing this. And what I mean is, if you know True Crime Rocket Science, you know it's the version that she suffered these injuries post-mortem when he was, stomping on her body through the hatch, and I apologize for that image. But Watts didn't know when he was doing that what was going on inside her body. I think he just rationalized, she's dead already, she can't feel anything, and I need to get this done. That's kind of how he's thinking about it, and in some ways he's able to dissociate himself. But what happens here is the prosecutor reminds him that even if she was dead, this biting of her tongue was a really unpleasant thing for his child to go through. You know what I mean? It was just an ugly, horrible, gruesome thing for her body to experience. And as perhaps strange as that sounds, in the Patrick Frazee case, the disposal of poor Kelsey's remains is also got that same stomach turning quality. You know that she's died, but there's still a horrible sense that you just feel so bad for her, what happened even after she died. And it's that kind of thing that we're talking about. And I know when I saw those words, by the way, I was convinced that what happened to the frenulum was when Watts pushed Bella through the thief hatch. And so when I saw these words about banging his head against a wall months later, it confirmed for me that I was absolutely right. That because what is happening is, again, he's sympathizing with the prosecutor's words, and how he's sympathizing is he's imagining his own head banging against a wall. And isn't that what was happening with Bella's head? Her face was being pushed, banged against the side of that hatch. That's how she damaged her frenulum. That's also how those bite marks were made on her tongue. And it takes practice and it takes experience, and I want to guide you guys through watching the same clip again. This time I'm going to give you a few thoughts to put in your mind, and what I want you to do this time is either turn the volume off, or just, you can have the volume on, but don't think so much of the prosecutor's words when you listen this time. Think about what you're seeing with Chris Watts. Look closely, and again, try not to put a link between how Watts is showing his emotions and the words. Just look at Chris Watts and see what you see.
Your Honor, I understand very clearly. Bella fought back for her life. The frenulum, the connective tissue between her upper lip and her gum, had a centimeter and a half laceration. She bit her tongue multiple times before she died. She fought back for her life as her father smothered her. Celeste had no such injuries. In fact, she had no external injuries at all. But according to the medical examiner, she was smothered nonetheless. The defendant then methodically and calmly...
So, the first thing to point out is that we notice when this crucial, heart-wrenching piece of testimony is read out, the camera zooms in on Watts. And why is it zooming in on him? Because the cameraman knows to try to catch an emotion in Chris Watts. The cameraman's job is he's supposed to record the scene in court, but he's also supposed to sort of catch the moments, and this is one of them. It's a very stressful moment for especially the family, and especially for Chris Watts himself. You mustn't imagine that he's not feeling stress. He's in a situation where the whole world is hearing about his crime, and he wishes he wasn't there. He doesn't want to be in court. He doesn't want to be accountable in a public forum like this. He doesn't want to be there. And so the cameraman is zooming in to get Watts' reaction. And when you watch it the first time, you might think that there's no reaction. You're not seeing a clear grimace. You're not seeing or hearing audible sobbing. You're not seeing him take off his glasses and wipe his eyes. You're seeing him trying not to show emotion. And there's a reason why criminals try not to show emotion, because it's the emotions that led to them committing the crime. And they see their own emotions as a weakness, and it is a weakness. And so when you actually look closely, you can see what it looks like Chris Watts holding his breath while this testimony is being fielded, and then eventually he can't, and he opens his mouth and is overwhelmed. He's actually overwhelmed by his emotions, and his chest heaves. And I've seen this before when being present in the courtroom myself, where you see the perpetrator's face appearing expressionless, and yet you can sometimes see the color draining from their face, or their face darkening a little bit with blood as they're almost blushing. And you often see, although there doesn't seem to be any motion, as in movement, and there doesn't seem to be any visible emotion, no blinking or anything, you often see it might be a vein in their necks, or it might be the collar of their shirt. You see that heaving up and down. And what they're doing is they're breathing through their noses. And in Watts' case, he can't even do that. He's breathing through his mouth, and his chest heaves. And if you still think that he's not showing emotion there, his lawyer sitting to the left of him, John Walsh, actually leans over and he probably says to him, "Are you okay?" or "Everything's going to be okay. Just stay calm," or something like that. You also see his lawyer on Chris Watts' right hand side. Our left, you see the woman there gulping when the prosecutor mentions the frenulum. So they're also trying not to appear emotional, and they are emotional themselves. And you're wondering what they're thinking. Are they thinking, I don't really think that this is true, or they're thinking this is true? But what is Watts thinking? Bear in mind, if the version of True Crime Rocket Science is accurate, and Watts didn't smother his child and didn't injure her in this manner while she was alive, and that Bella didn't fight back and she didn't say, "Daddy, no," then this testimony, this accusation that he's getting is even more sort of hurtful, because it's not true, because he didn't mean to hurt his children in this way. I mean, he did mean to do what he did, but he didn't mean to viciously hurt them. And so that has got to sting him somewhat. Obviously we don't care, but he does. He cares about the fact that he probably wants to stand up and say, "It's not true, I gave them oxycodone." That's probably what he would want to say. But even that is, it's even that is unforgivable. But how does Watts say that without saying, opening up that old can of worms? When we acknowledge the emotional narrative, and I realize it's difficult to do that in the beginning, it's almost counterintuitive, because it seems like we are humanizing Chris Watts, and it seems like it's wrong to humanize him. I don't think it is. I don't think it's wrong to humanize anybody, because I think when we humanize someone else, we humanize ourselves. And it's not the same as sympathizing. As I say, it's the difference between when you are seeing something. So for example, if you look at this clip and you're seeing emotions with Chris Watts, that's not sympathizing with him. That is seeing. Sympathizing is when you take what you're seeing and you maybe suddenly feel sympathy. When I see that, I don't feel sympathy. I simply register that he is feeling emotions, and I also register that those emotions, the way that he's feeling those emotions, silently, trying to hold them in, it fits perfectly with him being an introvert, with him trying to be reserved, trying to hold back himself. And it also fits in with him not making a statement. He doesn't stand up in court and say anything, and it's because that's the kind of person that he is. It's also the reason why that he didn't get a divorce with Shanann, because he didn't want to talk to her, didn't want to negotiate, he didn't want to argue. In the discovery it says he couldn't bring himself to tell Shanann about Kissinger, because he couldn't argue, he couldn't win an argument. He's not that kind of person. He's not a good talker. He doesn't have any game in that department. And so what we see when we open this door to this question of no emotion, we see that emotions are the key. Emotions are the reason Watts behaves the way that he does. He just has a different way of expressing his emotions. He does have emotions. They are just different. His wiring is very different. And so when we look at this whole emotional question, we bring in Nicole Kissinger, we see that he didn't commit the crime because he didn't feel anything, but because he felt so much towards Nicole Kissinger. He was totally smitten with her, and she was very much in love with him as well. But could he handle those emotions in terms of his family? No. Did he know how to deal with the emotional issues of the pregnancy and the finances and a divorce? And think about a divorce just in the emotional narrative of it in terms of anyone in the world. How does anyone in the world deal with a divorce? It's a very emotional time. It's very emotional for the parents, very emotional for the children. It's a time when a lot happens and fortunes change, and Watts just couldn't see himself going through with it. I had a girlfriend who cheated on me. I was very much in love with her, and I came back I was in United Kingdom at the time. I was in London, and I came back, and even though she was already in another relationship, she was pretending that ours was still going on. And when she met me at the airport, I could sense something was going on, but the fact that she wasn't telling me made me think, well, maybe there's still hope for our relationship. And so I didn't want to address it full on. But in retrospect, we did break up, and she had been cheating on me for a long time, and it turned out, that obviously at the airport she couldn't bring herself to tell me. I think she knew it would break my heart, and it did. But I also think she was protecting herself. She couldn't bring herself to say what she had done. Not because she was heartless, even though for me that was quite a heartless thing to do, but because she just couldn't. She felt, I can't do this. She just couldn't bring herself to do it. And while that was very cruel from my perspective, from her perspective, it's not because she didn't have emotion, but because she did. Does that make sense? So emotions are the key. And so when you see a lack of concern or a lack of emotion from criminals, it's not because they don't have emotions, it's because they're focusing on trying to hide what they've done. And part of that is they're trying to hide the emotions that drove them to do what they did. Does that make sense? Do you see how emotions are actually a very important part of a crime and of criminal psychology, not irrelevant and unimportant, and he has no emotion, he has no remorse. If you look at the cards that he gave to Nicole Kessinger, it actually speaks of someone who is actually very emotional and very caught up. And obviously this is a sort of a sexual emotion, a romantic love emotion. It's not the loyalty that he has in terms of those emotions, those attachments to his family. And that's exactly the point, is that not that those feelings weren't there, but that those feelings of attachment shifted. And they shifted in a very visceral way for him. They shifted very quickly, and in a way that he didn't want to look back. He didn't want those attachments. He wanted to throw himself fully into this other relationship that he was in, a relationship that made him feel alive, a relationship that made him feel himself again. And compare that to the relationship he already had that made him feel like he was dying, that he was losing his life, that he was trapped and drowning. That was his emotional reality in that situation. So I hope I've shifted your emotional reality in terms of this case. It is a very important dimension of true crime as a whole. Once you start to understand the emotional dynamics, that's when you really get the inside track into the criminal psychology and all that. But you can't get there without knowing the true identity of who you're talking about. So you first got to get to know a person, their job, their nature, as in their temperament, their personality, their character. And from there you start to slowly figure your way to the dynamics and the emotions. And that comes at the very end, and it's very difficult to get to. Which is why it's so unfortunate that so many people are so quick right in the beginning to say, there are no emotions. He was an emotionless person. And that means he's a narcissist. It's a very simplistic way of looking at these people. And they are people. They are horrible people, and what they did was horrible. But they are human beings, and they also have emotions just like we do. They are just different. And I do think, as traumatizing as true crime can be and disturbing as it is, when we acknowledge the emotional realities of these criminals, these people who have dysfunctional emotions and who don't know how to deal with the emotions, that's where we can start to address our own emotions and how we deal with our emotions and how damaging they might be, or others' emotions might be in our lives, and why it's so important to address these. And that can only make us better individuals, making for better families, better friendships, better societies, better attachments all round, and maybe a better world overall. And so that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for listening. As always, this channel is all about debunking the myths. It's all about facts. That's why we anchor what we say with specific examples and specific statements from the discovery. Over the next couple of days, we'll go into Cindy Watts. We'll go into another aspect in terms of the dynamic of Nicole Kessinger that we're all missing. and then also again the person on the outside who has been helping Chris Watts all this time. And then I think on Thursday, is it, or is it tomorrow? Tomorrow I think we start off with the Nicole Atkinson transcripts, which should be quite good. Once again, just a reminder that I'm working on a book on Prince Andrew. Hopefully it'll be out before Christmas, but no promises there. Once again, thank you for joining Patreon. You'll notice that the intensity of these videos is greater than those on the other channel. I try to go to a lot more effort just to give you guys value for money. If you'd prefer shorter videos, let me know, and we'll try and shorten them down to say 20 to 30 minutes. Otherwise, thank you for listening. Thank you for your patronage, and I will see you again tomorrow.